So we fill out the form and they invite us to interview. So I was like, wow, this is incredible. And I'm freaking out because I had applied for YC back in 2020 with a cheese app idea. And you mentioned you're from Wisconsin. So I've seen a lot, like, I love cheese. So for an interview,
Wait, Zeno. So
yeah.
why did should the topic of this podcast be about that then? We
Yes,
changed
let's
it.
forget everything. Let's just talk about cheese.
Yeah. Welcome to Signal and Trace, a podcast produced by Highlight. My name is Jay, and I'm the CEO of Highlight. And with me, I have Chris with us, an engineer on our team. And today we're talking to Zeno, the CEO of Resend, a DevTools startup building a developer-friendly email infrastructure company. Resend is an interesting company because their offering is built on top of an open source project called React Email, which lets you build emails using React syntax or JSX. And they then built a company to help developers take that tooling to production. And if any of that is wrong, Zeno will correct me in a second. I'm excited to be talking to Zeno because, in my opinion, he's the epitome of developer marketing. His product is great, meaning Highlight also uses React Email. And he's honestly just a very nice and calming person to talk to. So I'm excited for that too. But overall, Zeno, thanks for coming. I want to start by talking about maybe the open source roots of Resend and all that kind of stuff. But before that, maybe you do a quick intro of yourself and then we'll get into it.
Yeah, thank you so much, Jay, for the kind words. Yeah, the respect is mutual. I remember when we joined YC and I saw Highlight, I was so impressed. I was like, these guys, they get it. They know what it takes to build like a dev tools in 2023 back then.
Yeah.
So
Time flies.
time flies. So yeah, super excited to be here. I've been spending a lot of my time thinking about APIs, SDKs, and the communications space as a whole. But I've done a bunch of open source my whole life. I built this theme called Dracula, which has 7.5 million users only on VS Code. So I've done a bunch of stuff in the last 15 years. So yeah, excited to chat more about all this.
Yeah.
I've used
That
that theme for sure.
Really nice, nice.
maybe let's start with that. So Zeno, tell
Yeah.
us more about like
Mhm.
the early days in open source. And I guess on the Resend end, I'm curious about the the move from React Email to Resend and how um, calculated the decision was to do Resend with respect to starting React Email. But maybe before we even do that, I'm just curious about, yeah, open source, what got you into it, and then maybe we can transition into that sort of thing.
Yeah, I think I started with open source back in 2010. And that was a moment where I was learning how to code, and I found open source to be this place where I could learn from others. And I would be pushing code, and they would correct the code that I was pushing. And whenever I would put some code out, people would come in and they would send PRs and make it better. So it was just like this light bulb moment, which was very different from what I was used to do with like freelancing and building websites for your uncle, that type of thing, and making like some extra money on the side. This was like way more hours and making nothing, but it was super exciting. So my first open source project was called jQuery Boilerplate, and it was like just a pattern for you to build jQuery plugins. And I put it out there, built a nice website around it, launched, like just posted on Twitter, and Smashing Magazine picked it up. This was 2011, and it blew up. I was like, oh my gosh, what's happening? And people started like giving stars and all that. And I was like, oh wow, this is incredible. And then like one of the biggest influencers in the JavaScript space back then came in and sent a PR saying, this is all wrong, so delete everything. That way you can start over and make something better. This was the title of the PR, and the diff was actually removing all the files from the project. So that's how I got into open source, like in a
Nice,
very friendly way. Uh,
nice. And that, yeah, that rocketed your open source career. Like,
exactly. And
Nice.
it was nice because it put things in perspective in terms of like, people can be mean, people can be nice, and you got to be ready for both. Um, and also, it was a lesson of like, yeah, you just got to keep shipping. So, in that project in particular, I ended up accepting the PR, and I remember working with Adi Osmani, who wasn't at Google back then. He was still like
Oh yeah.
living in the UK and all that. And
These
we
are all like
started,
I feel like these
yeah.
are all Twitter personalities that like
Yeah, right.
are real people, actually, turns out.
Yeah, totally, man. And yeah, so I kept doing open source. In 2015, I launched a project called Clipboard.js. So if you're using a copy to Clipboard in the web, it's probably powered by Clipboard.js. It has 31,000 GitHub stars now. So that project blew up, and then Dracula also it came to become this huge fame, more than 300 themes, and it was just like a way to learn and to give back. And I started to notice like patterns on like how can you actually build a project that people care, because I feel like with open source people just see the finish line as, oh, I pushed the code, it's live, so that's open source. And I feel like that's just the beginning. So when I thought about creating my own thing, I'm like, you gotta have an open source component, that's for sure.
That's awesome. That's awesome. And then Zeno, tell us more about how that turned into React email, and then yeah, more into the transition into Resend itself.
For sure. We were having this pain ourselves, like we would have a designer. Back then, I was working at a company called WorkOS, and we would have a designer build this beautiful email in Figma, and then they would hand off to the developers. And now you are faced with like this gigantic problem in front of you because you quickly realize that building for emails is not the same as building for the web. It's still very much, archaic HTML and CSS. You still have to use tables. It's still like very much the way it used to be the web. You had to build a website for IE6 and Firefox and Opera and all these browsers. Today, that's a solved problem for the web, but not for email. So I was like just having a blast working with Next.js and Tailwind and React and TypeScript. So I was like, we need to bring all these cool modern technologies to the email world. So let's give it a shot. So back then we were already playing around with this idea of creating Resend. Still not this name. It was just like this exercise of like, let's just see if we could build a stripe of email, a Vercel of email. How would that look like?
Yep.
So we're building that on the side, and then we noticed this pain when talking to our friends and ourselves. So I'm super big into storytelling. So we were like, how can we even gonna go about talking about this publicly? So we said, you know what? Let's build those two things in parallel. Let's not talk about Resend at all. Let's first launch React email, and then we talk about Resend. And I remember writing this Notion doc called The Master Plan, and it had 3 bullet points on it. The first one was launch an open source project around email. The second one was establish ourselves as email experts. And then the third one was launch a SaaS for email. And that was very much the trajectory of the user. Like, I'm building the email template. Here's React email for you. And now that I have this template ready with React, I can either compile it to HTML and use some tool, or I can just use that same React code and send through a SaaS called Resend. So we announced React email in December 2022, and we shipped Resend in January 2023 when we got into YC.
Oh wow. Wow. That's awesome. And so you did at the beginning when you first started it, Zeno, were you thinking like, I don't know if I guess before the master plan and before even like writing your first line of code, were you not sure if it was going to be a SaaS or an open source project or like the form it would take, or were you basically like, yeah, like what how much did you have in your mind, I guess, until you kind of like went all in and were like, hey, we're starting something in this space.
Yeah, I knew like that we needed a way to make money. Like that was like a simple thing. And I quickly learned that through these other projects that I worked with. So Dracula is one where I worked for this on this project for like 10 plus years now. And in the beginning, like there were years that I really enjoyed like contributing, years that I completely stopped coding, and then I would come back and make it active again. And then at some point in 2020, I decided, oh, let me do a commercial version of Dracula to so I can keep shipping this. So I have like the motivation besides just like the intrinsic motivation of contributing. Like I can actually tell my wife and my daughter, hey, like I'm actually like doing something here for us. It's not just me indulging myself. So I learned like the power of doing that. And Dracula Pro, which is this commercial version, ended up selling more than $300,000. So for me, I was like, wow, this is incredible. Like you can actually make money on the web, and you can, support the open source version by creating this paid thing. This is incredible. So
Yeah.
when I was thinking about this idea with email, I was like, we gotta have an open source component, but that doesn't mean we're gonna be an open source company. It's not like we're shipping this Docker container that you can go ahead and put on your servers. Like we're gonna have to support ourselves and our team with a paid product, and that's gonna be a SaaS. And that's just like the standard of the industry too. I just looked around. I'm like, okay, this is how people do it. This is how users are used to.
Yep.
Because you need an infrastructure. You don't really want to have to like deploy that on your internal servers. So we're like, okay, that's what we're doing. We have our Next.js, which is React email, and then we have our SaaS, our Vercel, which is Resend.
Understood.
And how are you able to, I mean, that's a pretty long time to go from, 1 year of just open source development, even before launching the SaaS product. I mean, did you take investment early on, or was YC the first investment? Or yeah, were you doing other things in the background to keep paying yourself?
It was super interesting because, YC was this turning point where we were playing around with this idea, and we just applied to IC to learn more about what we were doing, because the forum is so nice and there are so many interesting questions that you actually learn just by filling it out. So for anyone listening, even if you don't have like a super, structured idea, even if you don't have a master plan or whatever, just like having a POC and something on your mind, I feel like it's already super useful to go ahead and apply, because you learn a lot from the process. So for us was like, okay, let's just fill out the form and see what happens. So we fill out the form and they invite us to interview. So I was like, wow, this is incredible. And I'm freaking out because I had applied for YC back in 2020 with a cheese app idea. And you mentioned you're from Wisconsin. So I've seen a lot, like I love cheese. So I applied and I was rejected right away. So when they invited me for an interview,
Wait, Zeno. So
yeah,
should the topic of this podcast be about that then? Should we
yes,
change
let's
it?
forget everything. Let's just talk about cheese.
Yeah, I mean it's a common desire of both Chris and Zeno. Anyway, sorry, keep going.
Yeah.
Maybe next podcast.
For sure, for sure. But then, like when they invited us to interview, I was still like working at my full time job, and I was actually very afraid of doing the whole entrepreneurship thing. My dad was an entrepreneur, and there's so much stuff I've seen growing up as a kid that I was like very afraid. So when they invited us, I was like, okay, what happens if they reject us? Because one thing is like, oh yeah, we go to this interview, we do super well, we have the YC money, now we can just quit our jobs and start this thing. But what happens if they don't? Is this gonna be the end of this thing that we're just playing around with? And I remember stopping and talking to a few friends of mine that have raised money in the past, and I told them like, oh, who did you raise from? Can you introduce me to some people? And I did like one or two calls with like angels, and I would do the pitch and they would tell me like, oh yeah, we would put like 40K on this. And then someone was like, oh yeah, I would put like 10K on this idea. I was like, that's awesome. That's the validation I need. So then when I came to interview with YC, I was like, hey, I feel like it's going to be amazing if we go with you all. But if we don't, that's totally fine. I have so much conviction. We're going to do this regardless of YC or not. But I think it's actually strategic if we do it with YC. And here's why. So, doing that was super good because the power dynamics changed during the interview, even though you only have like 10 minutes to do that whole thing. But we did that, and I feel like that was super useful. It gave me a lot of confidence that even if it doesn't work out, we're still going to be fine. We're still going to pursue this. So, of course, with YC was great because then it allowed me to quit my job. We got the 500K. But we were still very much like doing things that don't scale like YC tells you to do. In December, before they even wired the money, I remember going in and buying the Resend.com domain for like $30,000 or something for my own money because I was like, I have so much conviction and I need to get something really, really good. We need to like cause a good first impression. So yeah, it was super scary to make that jump, but oh man, I highly recommend to anyone who thinks about like building something one day. It's super super useful.
Amazing. Yeah, could you share a little bit maybe now about the progress you've made since YC, to the
Yeah,
extent you're
so
comfortable sharing numbers and everything?
for sure, for sure. Yeah, so I'm like super proud, of the team and what they've been able to accomplish. Like so far, Recent has just crossed 200,000 users in the platform. Just back in April, we had like 100,000. We just hit the 100,000 mark. So things are moving very, very fast. Uh, and in terms of like paying customers, it took us 1 year to go from 0 to 1,000 paying customers, and then it took us 6 months to go from 1,000 to 2,000, and just now, like in the past 3 months, we went from 2,000 to 3,000 paying customers. So you can see that compound effect at full display, and it's beautiful. And we're continuing to learn like what customers need, how to ship things to them, and React email is also growing a ton. So React email just crossed 1 million monthly downloads on NPM, 14,000 GitHub stars. So there's a lot of traction both on the open source front and both on Resend. And yeah, that's how we see those two projects. Like they can grow independently. And if people want to use React email with Resend, great. If they want to use React email with a competitor, we also have docs on how to do that. So yeah, like that has been the strategy since day one.
Yeah. And then could you talk a little bit about some of your competition? There's some pretty well established players in the space, SendGrid, Mailgun, et cetera. How do you explain how you're differentiated to folks?
Man, yeah, this is the thing that even like since day one, when we came out and said, hey, we're building an email API, and people are like, really? Like, why? Like, isn't this a solved problem? Uh, and what I realized for myself, because I was sending emails at different capacities for like different things, right? So I had Dracula and I was using Mailgun, and I was like, not Mailgun, MailChimp for Dracula, and I was like, okay, this tool is nice, but it's not really built for me as a developer. Maybe it's built for like a small business owner, mom and pop shop. And then I saw Mailgun. I was using Mailgun for inbound emails for my personal domain. I was like, oh, this is good, but it feels so outdated. Like it works, but I don't see myself as a user of this platform. And we were using Postmark at my previous job, so I knew what that was about too. So I had a lot of exposure to all of these competitors at different capacities. And before that job, I was using SparkPost too, and so I've just seen a lot of those. And when I started looking closely, I've noticed that all of them started around 2008, 2009, and they all have been acquired by now. And I felt that way of like, man, these guys are not evolving at all. It's just like they keep the same product. They actually make it worse because after acquisitions, people might, fire their support team and they want to reduce costs and they want to increase prices. So I was just seeing like, okay, things are not getting any better. So the whole thing was like, the web has changed so much, and web development as a whole, like software engineering, has changed so much too. Like today we have serverless, and there's so many new frameworks. And you go to these competitors, and you're like, okay, let me see how I can send an email using Cloudflare Workers. No, Cloudflare Workers is huge. Serverless is huge. I'm sure there's a guide around it, and there's nothing. So you can tell like they simply haven't really like evolved at the same pace of the rest of the industry. So I saw a gap, and I'm like, I'm gonna build a product that is extremely high quality, because I don't see that being the case for these other folks. And it's going to be extremely focused on performance. You send an email, you get that email right away in your inbox. And it's going to be, we're going to build in public. So we're going to put a handbook live, and we're going to tell all of our strategy so everyone can see it, what we're doing. So those are some of the elements that I strongly felt about. And also in terms of brand, like I absolutely, focus all my time thinking how we can make the Resend brand better. And by doing that, we're going to attract the right people, and maybe we're going to push away the type of users that we don't really think they don't really care as much. So yeah, so that has been a lot of my focus since we started, and I feel like that's how we differentiate by doing these things.
Zeno, I wanted to ask a little bit about your you mentioned building in public. I'm curious. So one thing that I've noticed, and sorry for all the hard questions, but one thing I've noticed is that you're even in beyond building in public with regard to the company strategy and how you talk to customers and things like that, which is very respectable. You also talk about the things that go wrong at Resend, like some of the incidents that have happened and things like that. I don't want to focus on any of the particular incidents or anything, but I'm curious, like, how has that changed external perception, but also like internal morale? And I feel like from my perspective, actually, like I feel like early on sharing the hard things about a company and building a company is tough because it's like your baby, and then you don't want to like, you know what I mean? You kind of don't want to give it up because you want everyone to think that everything's going really well, right? But then once you start sharing these things, you realize that everyone wants you to win. Um, and that's the best way to do it. At least that's my stance on it, right? And so I'm curious what your stance on it, and if you have any particular learnings or stories, I'd love to hear that too.
Yeah, I feel like there are multiple flavors of building in public, right? You have the indie hacker flavor that's going to share revenue numbers as you go. You have the radical transparency flavor where we're going to open the salaries of our team members. There's just a lot of different versions. What the version that I subscribe is the version of being authentic, and even if that means you know showing vulnerability, and being vulnerable is extremely hard, because exactly like you said, like you don't want to show that, hey, we messed this thing up, hey, we made a wrong call here, we made a bad decision there. But when you're building a company, what you're trying to do is to gain trust. And if you're only showing the great stuff, I'm sorry, but people are not going to trust you, because they know that's not the reality. Like, there's no company or not a single human being who's always doing things the right way. It's actually the opposite. As founders, we're constantly messing things up. We're making mistakes every single day. I feel like I'm a terrible father, I'm a terrible husband, I'm a terrible founder, and I'm trying to do my best with everything I can. But like sometimes you don't, and that's fine, because we're all humans, and that's part of being a human. So I feel like that's the way. And also, you should do whatever feels natural to you, and you should be very aligned with your values. So I can tell a story from the YC days. I remember when Paul Graham came in to our batch and gave like a talk to all the founders, and he said one thing that really stuck with me. He said, we come in, we tell you all these things on how you should, like what founders should do, but you don't listen to us. You go and you make your own mistakes, and then you come back 6 months later and you tell us, oh, I should have listened to you earlier. You are right all the time. So when I heard that, I was like, I gotta ask my partners, what am I doing wrong right now? So I came in and I asked each partner, and I remember one partner said this thing to me. They were like, oh, Zeno, you just focus too much on design, and you shouldn't be doing that. And I remember hearing that, and I was like, I felt hurt because he was right. Yes, I focused too much on design. And I was like, I came to my house, I was like so disappointed in myself. I'm like, oh, I'm doing this wrong thing. I shouldn't focus too much. That's not what's going to make us money or whatever. And then few days in, still like digesting that comment, I remember thinking, man, I would much rather have a company that makes 2x than a company that makes 100x, with a poor design, versus a company that with 2x that makes like high quality design and a product that I want to log in and use myself. So I was like, I'm just going to be true to myself, and I'm not going to ship crappy code. And yes, we're going to care about design. If we have to delay, a new feature 1, 2, 3 times because the quality is not there yet, that's what we're going to do. So, I feel like it's hard to know yourself, but for me, I'm just trying to do something that feels authentic to me and to my values, to the things that I believe. And I want to be proud of what I'm building at the end of the day. So if that means being vulnerable sometimes, if that means not following the advice of someone way more experienced, then yeah, that's what we're going to do.
Makes sense. Makes sense. Okay, the other question I had, Zeno, was about your team's focus on React email versus Resend. So I feel like Highlight and a lot of other open source businesses are different in that there's a lot more overlap, at least to my knowledge, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, right? There's a lot more overlap between the core business and the open source version of the business, right? Which I think gives you a lot of leverage, right? Where you can actually kind of like 1 quarter or 1 month, you can be like, let's focus less or more or something like that, right? So I'm curious about, how you think about that and how that's changed since maybe YC, let's say. So maybe we start there.
Yeah, man, that's so hard, especially when you have two different brands, right? The React email brand is one thing, it has specific colors, a different website, a different documentation altogether. And then we have Resend with completely different needs and sometimes different audiences too.
Yeah.
And it's so hard to then come in and say, oh yeah, let's forget about this customer who's sending 5 million emails every single month and focus on the open source who we don't know what they are doing. So we struggle a ton with just like rearranging resources and making sure we can do both at the same time. And I feel like we failed multiple times. There were weeks where like we should have spent way more time on the open source than we did on Resend. And other times where we're like, wow, we're just taking too much time here on the open source front. We can't forget Resend.
Yeah.
So I wish I had like a silver bullet for that. But at the end of the day, it's like, what can you do with the cards that are dealt to you?
Yeah.
And you're like, maybe now we do this, now we do that. And there's simply no right or wrong. It's just hard, extremely, extremely hard.
Makes sense.
How's it going managing open source contributions? You mentioned 14,000 stars. Are there a lot of people trying to push code, and are there tons of issues coming in, and how's it going just kind of keeping up with the open source community and their demands on the project?
Yeah, no, it's super tough. Like right now, I have this number on top of my mind because I looked it up yesterday. We have 132 contributors, and it's a lot of people, and they have so many different demands. Like there's some folks that are running our CLI and local server on Windows, and we don't have anybody on the team with a Windows machine. So they are like reporting all these bugs, and we got to figure out a way to reproduce and fix it because we want to be universal. We want everybody to be able to use the product. And then there's all these extremely edge cases with Tailwind, and once you start customizing Tailwind and adding all these different configs, and there are like just a lot of edge cases on how to parse Tailwind code and all that, which is a part of React Emo. We allow you to reuse the same Tailwind code that you have on your web page to also use on your email. So it's just very hard to keep up with the community. But what I truly believe is that getting a PR or getting an issue is a privilege. And you gotta treat that as like people that are coming in, they should be treated as royalty. Like they got out of their way, like they, instead of like watching more Netflix or spending time with their kids
Or eating cheese.
or building their own cheese app, they decided
Even worse.
they decided to come in and like open a new issue on your project and create like a reproducible use case or send a PR. Like they went through the trouble of reading your crappy code and send a PR. How amazing is that? And we just take for granted these things. And I did many, many times. And like, it's just something that we just gotta wrap our hand around it and be like, no, like if we're signing up for this, if we decided that we're gonna make it open source, then you gotta be true to that ethos of open source. And otherwise, better to just make it private and say like, oh yeah, this is not really, the way we do things, and that's fine. There's nothing wrong with closed source software, but if you are making open source, then you got to treat contributors as royalty.
Yeah, I think definitely, especially, I mean, any open source company, I think that's just one of the product feedback channels too, and I think that can be, if managed the right way, you can leverage it in a really powerful way.
Yeah, and you got to be true too. Like when you see a contribution, you're like, wow, this doesn't align with our roadmap, with our future of the product, or the quality bar that we're trying to meet. You got to be transparent and say, hey, this is not the direction we want to go. We're going to close this. Or hey, there are these, like the PR is only like 10% ready. Like there's still like 90% to go. And it's better to be upfront and talk about these things in public than just keeping things stale, and then 6 months later you close that PR instead of just addressing heads on.
Yeah.
Do you think, Zeno, did you have any success with any of these like bounty programs for open source? Like
Not much. Yeah.
not really. You
I
prefer
have
that your internal team work on those issues, yeah?
I have very little experience. Like, so anything I would say on that will be just an assumption because I haven't run these programs myself as much. I've seen people doing successfully, like call.com. I've seen them doing like a lot of progress with that, but I haven't run any of those yet.
Makes sense. Cool. Well, okay, the last question maybe before we jump off, is about dog fooding. So I imagine that you guys, this is, I guess, is a common theme of a lot of our podcast episodes now that we kind of talk to a lot of dev tools focused companies, but tell us more about how you dog food Resend at Resend and how that has shaped the future of the product.
Oh man, this is like the most important thing. And it's so clear when we don't dog food, like it's so clear that we missed the mark in terms of like what users were expecting, what we thought was like the end of a feature. No, like we actually didn't cover the most important things. So we always make sure, even when we're writing the RFC, when we're like specifying, okay, this is the problem we're trying to solve. This is like 3 possible solutions. This is the database modeling and all that. We talk about like what's the rollout. So we have like all this template for the RFC. We also talk about how we're going to roll out internally and how we're going to dog food. And if we don't have a use case, which like there's a project right now that we're building to enable users not only to send emails, but also to receive. So we don't have that pain right now ourselves, but we're figuring out like ideas so we can, and excuses for us to have that pain so we can then dog food that project. So I completely believe in like doing everything you can to dog food, or to drink your own champagne, whatever the term you want to use.
Yeah.
And we are always encouraging the team to like use the product. So one thing we do, for example, Johnny, who is our operations manager at Resend, he's a non-technical guy. He doesn't know how to code, but he is an extremely good problem solver. And like being an ops person at an early stage startup is hard. Like you have to juggle so many things, and it's hard to find peers because he's like, like I don't know other people who do that. So he started a newsletter called Founding Ops Society using Resend, and we internally like we give coupons for the team so they can use Resend for free forever. I use Resend every single time for Dracula, and I keep sending the Dracula emails using Resend. And guess what? Every month when I go in to send that email, I find something because I'm going through that problem from a user's perspective. I'm putting that hatch. And just recently, one thing super cool about that too, I would always like when I would find those issues, I would go in on Slack and I would tell the team, hey, this was bad. Like we should improve this. This is not good. But then Johnny recently went through the process of reporting bugs. So he's like, I'm a user, so I'm not going to go through Slack. I'm going to go through the support flow.
Yeah, as if I was a customer.
Man, that makes a whole difference because then the whole team who doesn't really go through the support flow themselves all the time, if they have to go through that, they see the pain of support too. And they're like, oh, I'm waiting for an answer. Is this fixed or not? Like they don't have access to everything that's going on. So I would highly recommend everybody to try that. It's so painful to watch because you're like, oh, I wish I had an answer earlier or a fix earlier. But you learn so much. It's great.
Yeah, makes sense. I feel like for us, it's been a transitioning from us. Well, we definitely dog food the product a lot within Highlight, but then now we do a lot more sales demos, and it's like in the sales demo, I've been a lot of people, or like I feel like a lot of salespeople will be like, you should just have a video that you click play on in the call.
Yep.
And I'm like, no, let's just actually demo the product, and if it's embarrassing, that's a good way to force yourself to like start fixing things, and maybe the engineering team has to deal with like 7 messages in like 1 minute after the sales call, but I feel like
we got to make Jay go through the public bug reporting process.
Yeah,
too.
that's one thing that we haven't done yet. That's one thing we haven't done yet.
Man, it's wild.
But anyway, cool, Zeno. We'll cut that out. Zeno, was really nice to chat with you. Chris,
I have
do you have
one
any
final
other
question.
Oh, go ahead.
You got to give us the pitch and the cheese hat. What was the product?
So do you know Vivino? Have you used Vivino by any chance?
Yeah.
What?
So
Like the wine.
Yeah, the wine app. So my whole thing was, if you want to drink a great wine, you go to the supermarket, you scan the wine, or if you have like 3 bottles at home, you scan, you see which one is the best. I wanted to do the same with cheese, and there was no app.
It's pretty simple, honestly.
And honestly, like I always felt that to be an entrepreneur, you had to be an inventor. That was like in my brain, like, oh yeah, you have all these people who are innovating and creating new things that were never imagined. So when I saw that there was no cheese app, I was like, oh yeah, I'm gonna build because there's no cheese database. Turns out the cheese app I built is the biggest cheese database in the world right now. But the what I learned was I don't have to invent, and that was a huge insight for Resend because I'm like, I'm not inventing anything new. This exists forever and will keep existing long gone, like long after Resend is gone or whatever. So I'm like, yeah, you just gotta make it 100 times better than what's out there, not 10 times, because 10 times it's not enough for people to switch. But if you do it 100 times better, then you can have a shot at something.
That's
Love it.
awesome. That inspires me to make the next cheese app that will
Yeah,
maybe compete with Zeno's cheese app.
let's do it.
I'll just add like three more cheeses, and then it'll
Yeah,
be the new biggest
yeah.
database of cheese. But no, more seriously, Zeno, this was awesome. I think you're you you've always been the person that I think is the best at like storytelling and giving the full picture of kind of the journey of the company and things like that. So I really appreciate that. I really appreciate transparency, and yeah, excited to see the future of Resend, and thanks for joining.
For sure. Yeah, really appreciate you, Jay, for inviting me in, and Chris. It was great meeting you too, and yeah, I hope this was helpful for everybody listening too.
It really was. Zeno, last thing is where can we find you? So give us some Twitter handle of Resend, of you, of React email, and we'll put everything in the show notes too.
Yeah, you can go to resend.com, sign up, you can start sending emails in just a few seconds. If you want to try React email, it's react.email, and we have a NPM package that you can download and start using. And yeah, I'm Zeno Rocha everywhere on Twitter, on GitHub, on Instagram, on LinkedIn. So whatever is your flavor for social, I'll probably be there. And yeah, we can hang out. I try to be active. I try to share the things we've been going through as we experience them. So yeah, happy to build all this together with you all.
Awesome. Thanks, Zeno.
Thanks so much, Zeno. Great to
Take
meet
care,
you.
sir.
Appreciate your time.